Thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for joining. I actually gave a presentation very similar to this at an MLA breakfast a couple of months ago, now 6 weeks or so ago now, and the result of that MLA were keen to get me along to chat here. I'm happy to do so. So the title there, we've got a switch over in titles. Greg gave you one. I've got the one that I think might have been advertised, which is Profitable Irrigated Forages for the Northern Australian Beef Industry, Fact or Fiction. Really the same title, just expressed in a different way. What I'd like to do in the first part before we break for a few questions is just an overview of the agriculture in the north in terms of irrigation, and it's much broader than beef and forages, but just where we've come from and what some of the current policy ambitions are, and then move into how beef and forages might fit into those broader ambitions. So I'll switch to the next slide if I can, which is an overview of irrigation in Northern Australia. And on to the next one, and hopefully you're seeing these, is the north is often viewed as having untapped potential, particularly in the context of irrigation. It's been a long-held policy ambition, and it has over the many decades now attracted a number of people who have had a go in seeing how they can develop the north. And this goes back quite a long way, back in the 1930s, some of the earliest developments. And in fact, the photo on the top right there is from Peak Downs in Queensland, 1949. Queensland British Food Corporation were in throes of the wash up from the Second World War, looking to improve food security in England, joined with Queensland to try to establish a large agricultural development there in central Queensland. And that has been going on through the decades, and so there's renewed enthusiasm from communities and government at the moment to develop the north as a key part of Australia's response in a number of fronts driving that response. One is developments in Asia and particularly around a growing economy in Asia and increasing demand for food. Broader issues of nation building and trying to build regional communities in Australia, and particularly Northern Australia. And there is this perception around untapped soil and water opportunities for ag development in the north. So that's some of the sort of longer historical context and current political context driving some of the moves towards irrigated agriculture in the north. Just to put that into context in terms of the actual resources, this here, the tropical north here is not, it's north of the Tropic of Capricorn here, is rather than a broader, for example, MLA definition of the north, which includes all of Queensland. So it's 20% or so of Australia's land mass, about 26% of the water, and there's upwards, certainly it's upwards of 17 million hectares that's potentially irrigable, and potentially being the word there in terms of soils that could be irrigated, and it contains 30% or so of Australia's beef herd, but at the moment is only a small fraction of Australia's irrigated area. And so it begs the question, is irrigated agriculture Northern Australia's Cinderella industry, or will it remain an elusive pot of gold? And this is just a screenshot from Queensland Country Life last year, talking about the Ord system, which has been going for 50 years or so now, and people pointing to the fact that it's not as successful as originally envisaged, although I mean it's an ever-changing environment up there, and there's a lot going on up there. That particular article was in the context of sandalwood plantations coming in and rather than it going towards food production. But there's both in sometimes equal doses optimism and scepticism around the opportunities in the north. One thing we can do is, in looking back at what has happened in the past, is learn from history and start matching some of our expectations with realities. And just to give a bit of a flavour of that, here's just snapshot in history of the opening of the Ord River Diversion Dam in 1963, which was opened by then Prime Minister Bob Menzies on the left there in Kununurra. And those in charge of the cotton work here, of course, are so enthusiastic they have already persuaded me, A, that it's the best cotton in the world, and B, that in due course and with occasional interruptions, it will be practically immune from pests and it will command the world's price. But in reality, by 1974, the cotton crop had received 30 applications of DDT in that particular year every few weeks, or in some cases less than every week. And with high costs and reductions in cotton subsidies and quality issues, it was no longer viable. So you can set off with some pretty high ideals, and the reality of your operating environment, whether it be financial or climatic or pest and disease related, as in this case, can bring you undone. And there are other examples. The one top left is that one I talked about before, the Queensland British Food Corporation in central Queensland in 1949. Another one was Lakeland Downs development in the late 60s, early 70s, driven by a mining magnate, Clive Foister, a different Clive. And although the one on the top right was well thought through in its concept, in that an area of irrigated grain on Lakeland Downs at Archer Point on the coast nearby. There was a grain storage facility built there, and the photo of it there in 1975, and contracts developed for the grain sorghum with Japan, and a system for loading it from into bigger boats from the shallow waters there at Archer Point. But it, for a number of reasons, particularly in the first few, had a few dry years, and then just couldn't quite get the supply chain worked out. It didn't persist in its original form, but Lakeland Downs are still there today and growing a variety of crops, including bananas. So these things often keep persisting, but not as how they were originally envisaged. But there are also successes. It's not certainly all praise, and just a few examples of those, and the photos here of the Burdekin, where there's obviously a successful sugarcane industry and other crops developing there. We've had Fairbairn Dam in central Queensland, Mariba Dimbula irrigation area on the Atherton tablelands. One thing that is common amongst those ones that have persisted and have been fairly successful is that there's been significant government investment in the primary infrastructure for the large-scale schemes, and there's been a fairly effective production and processing supply chains nearby. So in the case of the Burdekin, there was clearly a well-established sugar industry and the mills nearby, and they also constructed some additional mill capacity required to deal with the extra sugarcane growing there. Similarly in Emerald with Fairbairn Dam with cotton growing there, the existence of cotton or construction of cotton gins. So you've got to have a few of those key factors coming together for things to be successful, and I think the same thing will definitely play out in terms of opportunities for the beef industry and a number of factors needing to come together. So in thinking about that, what's the new investment? What does it require in terms of the confidence to move ahead? Well, it's having some idea of knowing about the uncertainties and at least a pathway for overcoming those. And there's still challenges and uncertainties of northern agriculture, which deters investment, particularly in terms of some of the projected returns on investment. But that is not stopping people looking to develop large-scale investments. Up in the Georgetown area at the moment, there's proposals to have a very large-scale irrigated agricultural system there. So that people are still seeing the opportunities and pursuing them. But given the environment, it can take time to generate returns on investment, and that needs sort of patient capital and building in the possibility of early phase, because if you look at all the historical examples of particularly the irrigated development in Northern Australia, whether it be Queensland or Northern Territory or WA, it takes time to learn how to operate in the new environment that you're in, and in many of those cases they hadn't factored in their financial planning those early failures, and it was as much the lack of ongoing cash flow to keep things going that killed off many of those things, many of those past schemes that didn't persist, more so than the environment per se. And key to that is scaling up at the right pace. So a lot of those, again, those ambitious schemes were trying to get to scale very quickly rather than sort of learning as you go along. I'll just pause there for a moment, Greg, and see if there are any questions.
Okay, just to take a quick break, has anyone got any questions they would like of Andrew at this present point in time? You can type your questions in. And I don't see any at this point in time, Andrew, so you can, if you continue, that'd be great.
Okay. So moving on now to get into a little more specifics around opportunities for beef production, particularly in the context of irrigation. There's the two areas I want to explore here are large-scale schemes versus mosaic irrigation. And the large-scale schemes here I'm talking about where you do put in usually a large storage system that historically has had significant government investment, but there are also opportunities to do that through private investment, versus mosaic irrigation where there's small-scale irrigation dotted across the landscape, and the capital for that almost inevitably will be from private means in undertaking those small-scale irrigation schemes. The second area there is forages for beef versus diversifying into crop production. So it may not necessarily be the best advantage to think of it narrowly in a beef development context. It may be that there's more economic opportunities in using small-scale irrigation, for example, to grow crops that are then sold as a second sort of enterprise, but together you can make more of the overall resource than just through a beef lens. So they're the two areas I want to explore, but just in providing a bit more context for that, if we look at the current situation of the areas of irrigated pasture and grain crops, of course grain crops can be integrated into beef systems, particularly with some more intensive feeding. So here is just taken from some ABARES data from 2010, the areas of irrigated pasture and grain crops in the north split up by region. And on the left, the first column there is the total number of hectares, million hectares there, in millions, I should say, hectares. And then the irrigated pasture and grain. And the right-hand column is the percentage of that irrigated pasture and grain land that is pasture. So if we look there at, say, north and far north Queensland, 11,000 hectares there of irrigated area, which would include patches down in the lower Burdekin, some up in Mareeba Dimbula, some around Georgetown, some out Richmond Way, all adding up to, at least in 2010, based on ABARES data, of 11,000 hectares, and about half of that actually under pasture, the other half would have been under grain. But you can see, apart from those two first areas in Queensland, central and far north Queensland, the area under irrigation compared with the total area of land is minuscule. In the Barkly, it's zero there, and the Pilbara is pretty much just one entity. That's Rio Tinto in the Hammersley agricultural project, where they're using mine dewatering to irrigate about 900 hectares of Rhodes grass for hay production. So the amount currently used for forages and beef production is very small. Just moving on and talking about the large-scale sort of schemes, and I'm just going to draw here on a recently completed work undertaken by CSIRO and in partnership with Queensland Government, part of the NQ irrigated agricultural strategy. But this case, particular study was the Flinders and Gilbert agricultural resource assessment, where they looked at both those two catchments there, shown in that figure on the left there, with the catchments marked in the sort of bottom, the coloured ones in the bottom and up in the top right there. And where currently those catchments are greater than 90% pastoral and total area of irrigation less than about 1,000 hectares, or even as we speak, that's changing. For example, plans on Strathmore for crop development there, some of which is irrigated, a lot dry land, but at the moment relatively undeveloped in terms of irrigation potential. So in that particular study, and this is just really highlighting what needs to be done before you can get into particularly some of the large-scale investments, is you need to identify the soil and water resources, quantify the productivity and scale of the irrigated agriculture opportunities, and quantify the costs and benefits and the distribution amongst different users, just to get a handle on some of the economics. And just and the key findings here are broad, and they apply to field crops, food crops, industrial crops as much as they do to forages and that might be used for the beef industry. Despite the close proximity, those two catchments vary widely in their attributes, their physical attributes and their rainfall and the pattern and reliability of rainfall. And so you can't, one of the messages from that is that you need to understand the context of the region that you're in for any of these developments. And you've got to do that at local scales. Then the Flinders farm dams can enable about 10 to 20,000 hectares of irrigation in 70 to 80% of years. There's just 20-30% of years where you won't get much of that, the dry years, a couple of which we've been experiencing lately. In the Gilbert, there's an opportunity there for in-stream dams that can enable 20 to 30,000 hectares of irrigation in 85% of years. They didn't identify any particular large-scale dam opportunities in the Flinders region, just the nature of where the water occurs in that region. A lot of it accumulates very close to the mouth of the river. We've got wide floodplains and not very many opportunities to store it, whereas much further upstream, where you've got the relief and possibilities for putting some dams in, you haven't got the water. You're in the drier part of the catchment, and the reliability of the water is very low, so it's hard to put catchments there. But there are dams there, but there are opportunities in the Gilbert. And significant water use would amplify some of the ecological challenges, particularly in those dry years, not so much in the normal or wet years. Just some general findings that the soils are often better and more extensive than previously considered. So I think in that case study alone, they found that there's probably 8 million hectares that you could potentially irrigate. The water supply is unreliable from a year-to-year basis, just because of the very high variability of rainfall that occurs in that North Queensland environment. And so the available water is often a small percentage of the total. And you've got limited opportunities there for scale, large-scale capture there. Said those two areas added up to about 50,000 hectares. But despite those challenges, irrigated opportunities do exist, but it takes a lot of work to separate the opportunity from the risk. So the key large-scale schemes, the key issues and opportunities that come from those is that one is the very high capital costs to establish dams, channels, infrastructure. So in the case of a dam where you want to irrigate 20 to 30,000 hectares with reasonably high reliability, somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion for the storage to be able to do that. If you assume full capital costs are incorporated in water charges, then you start to get some very high charges for water, around $250 per megalitre. And if you if you're using a forage crop, for example, that might use 8 megalitres per hectare, you start to end up with some high water costs there, you know, a couple of $1,000s per hectare, which you would never recover for a forage crop from the revenue, whether it be hay or grazing it directly for growing animals. However, if the government or the public purse in general provides the dam and water conveyancing only, and then it's left up to the private sector around the taking that water from the distribution scheme and on farm costs, then the water charges drop down to, you know, much lower levels of $36 a megalitre, and you can start irrigated forage crops become viable for hay production at around $100 to $150 a tonne, which is certainly achievable. The other point to make is that the opportunities may lie, in fact, the integration of cropping systems with beef production systems. So it's not one or the other. It's potential benefits in having a cropping system there where you'll get flow-on effects for the beef industry, and just for example, take coarse grains, maize or sorghum, depending on where you grow it in these regions, trucking it any distance, particularly the relatively low value per tonne, quickly eats into your profits, and there may be more opportunity to start seeing how you can integrate that grain production in more localised intensive beef systems, and that's just one example. Another is that just by virtue of a larger scale irrigated system there, that throws up some opportunities surrounding that might be in dryland cropping, forage crops, just with the expertise and skills and the farm machinery that comes into play there. There's an opportunity to build and piggyback on that for the benefit of something like the beef industry in terms of growing forages surrounding an irrigated cropping scheme that might be growing food crops or industrial crops. So that are some of the issues associated with the large sort of scale schemes and how the beef sector might fit in there. Mosaic agriculture there, and that picture there gives an example of you know, obviously a large sort of centre pivot in a extensive beef system, and they can Mosaic irrigated agriculture has a number of possibilities for the source of water. They can be surface water from streams and rivers. It can be from groundwater, or it can be ring tanks where water is pumped up into those from a river in times of high flow, and then used perhaps in the middle of the year to grow forages. And the slide here on key opportunities are some results of a second study. So I talked about the Flinders and Gilbert agricultural resource assessment before. Ian Watson and a whole lot of colleagues did some work also in the last 6 months or so or completed in the last 6 months at the end of last year, started this year, around mosaic agriculture with a particular focus on the beef sector. And some of the key opportunities they identified from that work was a high proportion of that Northern Australia's pastoral properties may have enough suitable soils and water for small-scale irrigation, and the ready availability of forage can drive a whole lot of opportunities in being able to boost productivity, but probably also be able to diversify some of the markets instead of being relying on a single market, as many of the existing enterprises are, as being able to diversify opportunities for where beef goes. And this system is not dependent on large-scale public investment in infrastructure. It can be built from within individual enterprises, but as we'll go on and show in a minute, still requires some significant capital investment even at MOS scales. And the environmental impacts of mosaic irrigation will be small compared with those of even within the context of a large extensive cattle operation. A few hundred hectares, for example, of irrigation is going to be a very small impact. If we now move in, and so I'll start diving into a bit more detail here around some of the capital costs, and these tend to be somewhere in the order of $7,000 to $10,000 per hectare, depending on where you are and the type of irrigation scheme you're trying to put in place. But here's just one example from work that Steve Petty did in the East Kimberley, where it came up near $10,000 a hectare, and a large chunk of that $7,000 to $10,000, if you're using things like centre pivots, is in that, the setting up of that, the pivot, the bore, and the pump to operate that. But in that case, somewhere up near that $10,000 a hectare, if you haven't got much clearing to do, if you're going into a sort of a nice treeless clay plain, then some of those costs might be reduced from the preparation side of things, but you may have more in some of the other areas of the irrigation system. But that tend to be the numbers that tend to emerge from looking at what it takes to prepare land for irrigation. So if we now look at some of the returns, and this is work taken from this Mosaic Ag report, and in this case it's a North Queensland scenario, finishing some export ox, the 300 kilo carcass there by 30 to 36 months at the older. So really it's taking the last, or the second last and last sort of cohorts of steers and finishing those on irrigated pasture. And there are three scenarios here, and the first is lab, so legume forage. The second is here with Bambatsi panic, and these forages were simulated using a forage crop model app sim, and certainly for lab and for the last forage sorghum, there's pretty good data on the productivity of those. The Bambatsi one is more a scenario than, I think, a reality at the moment, because as I'll show in a moment, it was simulated to have pretty high yields and also fairly high protein content in the forage. But so if we look at it as an example of what might be achieved under ideal sort of situations and where some of the technology might and improvement in forages might take us, then it needs to be viewed in that sort of context. So the scale of irrigation required to feed those sort of cohorts coming from an operation that's got around 2,500 or so adult equivalents. So a lot of those obviously breeders. Then you've got the younger cohorts of animals and the female replacements. So in that you've probably got each cohort of finishing steers, you've got a few hundred. So you've got the different areas of irrigation there for lab, Bambatsi and forage sorghum, and some of the financial figures there, and probably the important ones are down the bottom there, where you can look at your gross margin per AE, and you can see under all the irrigation scenarios that goes up. The average net profit goes up for lab and is very high under that, or goes up considerably under the Bambatsi scenario, but in fact you get effectively a net loss from the forage sorghum scenario there, simply because of the interest payments on the capital investment there, where you've got 1.3 million are not being recouped in the additional live weight productivity that you're getting from the animal finishing on the forage sorghum. So the return on investment there under the lab was about 6%, which is probably in a risky agricultural context is marginal. The Bambatsi one is quite high there, 24, or certainly would be attractive, and the forage sorghum there is coming up -2, obviously, because there's a loss made. So the message from this is it can be highly variable, and it's very dependent on the productivity that you can get out of your forage system given the high capital costs involved. It's not just a walk up will make a profit out of this. There's some hard yards to be done in getting the right system to work. And on the next slide is a scenario for the Kimberley, where in this case it was early weaning to lift calving rates and producing 350 kilo live export animals by 24 months. So where under the baseline scenarios there, weaning rates are in, say, the low 50s. It's trying to take a bit of pressure off the cows there by taking the calves off a bit earlier and get them cycling and into to calf again, and that way lift the calving rates for the overall herd, and at the same time have some of the younger animals just coming off in time to go on the boat. Now, of course, the live export protocols and requirements to go into the various markets are shifting fairly regularly at the moment. So that scenario was based on before some of the weight restrictions were recently lifted. But again, you can see in the lab there, but a pretty reasonable return on investment there. But the forage sorghum, again, as in the North Queensland scenario, because of the large capital cost involved, in this case 4.2 million to put in 5,000 hectares, so it was just over $8,000 a hectare in that case in capital investment, that it made a loss. The next slide is really what's driving that. So the forage sorghum, the quality of forage sorghum, at least from data collected, is somewhere more often than not in that sort of area of 1% nitrogen on the bottom axis there, in 1%, and yields of 10 to 20 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. You can get high yields than that if you get into some really high density sowing and whatnot, but just around some of the stock standard sort of forage sorghum, and that's part of the reason it's driving those, or why you're getting those losses. In contrast, the top there, the Bambatsi, as I said, which was is more a scenario than a reality in my view at the moment, where you're getting 30 to 40 tonnes of dry matter per hectare and a forage quality in that closer to 1 to 1.5% in, which does permit some pretty impressive gains from the animals that you're putting on there. But if you can get a forage with those sort of specifications, then there are opportunities to start generating some profits. And in terms of that dry matter production, that is achievable over in the Pilbara, and the systems that they're using in that Hammersley agricultural project. They are getting forage sorghum, Rhodes grass yields of somewhere up around 40 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. The quality there is still probably down under 1% in, but those sorts of yields are possible. Greg, I'll just pause there again for some questions, because there's a fair bit of detail there, and before I move into the last area.
Yep, absolutely. And we do have some, Andrew. Just going back to a couple of slides in your presentation, does the return on investment figure that you had in those slides incorporate depreciation costs?
Yes, it does. I think it has got some depreciation costs in there on that, because the equipment, say the irrigation equipment that you put in place, I think, to the best of my recollection from that Mosaic study, had something like a 15-year depreciation life on the equipment, and it would have been depreciated over that time frame.
Yep, good day. Another one, could you please repeat the definitions for Mosaic agriculture and Mosaic irrigation?
Okay, I probably interchange those there, but they're basically the same thing. So the Mosaic is where you have smallish areas of irrigation, whether that be used for forages or for crops. So it's the emphasis there is on the small areas dotted across the landscape, you might say, where you have access to water, and you can irrigate those areas that might be in the order of 50 hectares up to a couple of 100 hectares. Usually, typically, that would be I would think would be the larger size for some of those Mosaic irrigation areas in the individual areas, possibly even a bit higher than that. But and it relies on more locally available water sources, whether that be water that can be extracted directly from rivers under license, or groundwater allocations that can be used, or indeed pumping up into ring tanks. So it usually would involve some potential you could go to furrow irrigation, but more likely to have some sort of more overhead type irrigation scheme, like a centre pivot, with whatever, in each centre pivot is whatever 40 hectares or so, and so the definition there of the mosaic is on that small scale, but probably could occur in a whole range of locations across the north.
Okay, thank you for that. In relation to the cropping system, what about stand and graze, and how does this compare to a cut and carry scenario?
Yeah. So the trade-offs with the grazing situation is that typically you can probably only utilise about 50% of the forage that's grown, because of you've usually got very high stock numbers in there, often 3 or 4 animals per hectare, and so you get some trampling effects, and typically you can only utilise half of it, but it's going directly, it's been consumed directly by animals and getting the value added directly through the animals. The alternative is hay, and I'll perhaps get on and do a little bit of that in a moment, is where you can harvest 90% of the material that's grown, but of course you need some additional equipment and input costs there in harvesting that. And particularly if you can get a very high yielding crop like Bambatsi there at 20-30 tonnes a hectare, you probably, during a growing year, you're probably going to have to harvest that 4 or 5 times to make sure you're harvesting it at a fairly young stage, and so that the quality remains high. Perhaps one of the challenges for hay is that there will be, you're fairly quickly going to run into supply and demand constraints, I think, there, that while there is a demand for hay across the north, how quickly will that demand be satisfied? And I think profitability of hay production quickly deteriorates if you've got to start transporting it any distance. So they're the sort of trade-offs that need to be considered.
Okay, just conscious of time, just one more quick question. Going back a couple more slides than the one you are on now, how was the 70 to 80% of years figure determined?
Yeah, that's where, well, there's enough water driven by the rainfall to extract water from the system to pump, say, into ring tanks, and so you've got one in sort of a bit over 4 years there, or so, 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 years, where there just won't be enough flow to extract water, and it's unlikely that you would have carryover water from one year to the next. Even in a ring tank system, you'd probably be planning to use that all on one crop. So one of the issues and applies particularly in North Queensland, from that Flinders area right around to Georgetown, is that the coefficient of variability in rainfall is over 40% or so. So when affected by El Ninos in particular, so that drives down the reliability, and the only way of getting that reliability up is to either build bigger storages so that you can carry more over and you can use it every year, or put a dam in a more reliable situation. So just by way of example, if you go to the Ord Dam, and it's just a remarkable water storage, in that can provide 850 or so gigalitres of water per year with over 95% reliability, simply because the storage, the dam itself, Lake Argyle, is 10,000 gigalitres, just huge, and you have very high reliability. So you can trade off, you can invest more in your capital up front and get higher reliability, but will you get a return on that? That's the big question.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have plenty of other questions, but I'm conscious of time, so if we could go on to the next part of your presentation, that'd be terrific.
Okay, so in terms of different options, and we covered this in a question almost, so I can skip through this one fairly quickly. So, as I said, grazing of irrigated versus forage options, grazing versus hay. You get a lot of trampling and wastage in a grazing situation. Hay crops, you can utilise 90% of what is grown. Now, if you're grazing, of course, you've got to have a market for those animals. are there, and in that situation, those analyses there, we assumed there was an abattoirs within reasonable distance for that North Queensland example, which there is. But you do need well-integrated supply chains if you're going to be looking at finishing animals. The Kimberley scenario there, we had them for a different reason, and I should make the point in both of those scenarios there, they're just two scenarios. People will have all sorts of different classes of animals that they think might work for them in their particular situation. The last point there, as I said before, is the hay crops need to be utilised within reasonable distance of production to be cost effective, unless there are some means of some backloading arrangement where you might have trucks taking gear out to mines or something or other and returning otherwise empty, and you can sometimes negotiate some very good sort of backloading rates but that's going to be more opportunistic than I think standard, but that would probably be the only means by which I think you could transport any commodity, and particularly hay, some distance. So what are the opportunities next for, when we talk to, and a question about mosaic agriculture, what are the opportunities for scaling it up now? Some of the assessments for the north, and these are a lot of uncertainty on this because we still don't know a lot about the groundwater resources across northern Australia. A lot of it is sort of estimated, and you really got to go in and do some drilling of the aquifers to find out what's really there. But based on those estimates, and fairly conservatively, that there may be 600 gigalitres or so of groundwater, and reliable local surface supplies for mosaic ag in the tropical north. And if you assumed 10 megalitres per hectare and 20 tonnes per hectare of forage, that could finish somewhere around 100,000 head per year at a value of $1,000 a head. And that was based on just one very simple back of the envelope assumption there as on finishing heavier animals, and that could add $100 million or so in gross value of production across the north, just if you do those simple sums. Next bit is, as I said, is perhaps it's too narrow a lens to be thinking of irrigation in the context of beef in the north in just pasture forage situation. And so here's listed some gross margins for a range of irrigated crops in the Flinders catchment, and this comes from that Flinders and Gilbert Agricultural Resource Assessment Figara study, and assumes no, you're not paying for the capital costs of the water infrastructure here, so it's just gross margin based on the operating costs for pumping that water and growing the crops, and so the gross margins per hectare, say for lab hay at $160 a tonne, you're around $1,000 a hectare. Cotton, it's assuming there's a gin nearby, $2,500 a hectare. Maize around $1,200, and grain sorghum, interestingly, down at $230 a tonne, somewhat lower. Part of that's driven by the fact that you have got to freight that maize and that grain sorghum. So you can see that forages can compete with, say, the broadacre or grain crops, or the coarse grains, but probably not with some of the higher value crops like cotton or even sugar if you've got a mill nearby, or for that matter, some horticultural crops. But it is comparable with the broadacre grains, and that might provide some opportunities for integrating both sort of grain and forage hay. So the higher returns that hay can be generated than some of those crops, but it's not universally so. The big issues here around diversifying into crops is the distance to markets, and you quickly run into problems for your broadacre sort of food and industrial crops. Particularly for the industrial crops, you've almost inevitably got to have a processing plant of some sort nearby. that be a cotton gin or a sugar mill for those crops. And if you've got to take grain crops a long distance, then you quickly erode their profitability. Once you get over about 400 or 500 kilometres in transport distance, the profitability drops away altogether. There's the issue of skills and capacity to undertake cropping operations. So it's not a matter of saying, well, we think we can make more, we'll grow some high value food crop. You actually need the skills and the ability to do that, and some agronomic expertise nearby, which is not there at the moment, and support services for machinery. That can be a real issue, and it's a real issue now, not in places too far away from being well serviced. I know, for example, on the Lakeland Downs, for some of the people there growing irrigated forage crops, they really struggled to get a mechanic to come and service anything because of the demand from the mining sector, the coal seam gas sector and mining sector in that region. So it's that whole side of the support for cropping needs to be taken into account. So just the last slide here, the key message that there are opportunities for irrigation, particularly for the beef industry, but they'll need to be targeted and need careful planning, because as we saw on those returns on investment, that if you don't do it right, it's easy to make a loss, and I think that's been borne out by a lot of people who've tried that or trying it across the north. It needs careful planning. The capital required is significant. If you're up near $10,000 a hectare, and you somehow need into that financial plan, as well as the capital, is building in that learning phase, and whether that just be from just understanding the agronomy, or whether you just get bad luck with the poor seasons and those sort of 2 El Nino years come in your first few that you're operating and you've got no water to irrigate and you've got all the capital costs. So being able to do that and plan for that. Development of large-scale agricultural schemes, I think, even if they're not growing crops that can be directly used by the beef industry, in some cases they can be. It could be rotations for pulses, for example, with sugar, or even rice. You can have a pulse rotation in there, which could be used for the beef industry. But as I said earlier, perhaps around the margins there of the irrigated areas, opportunistic dryland grain and hay crops. So just accept you might be running a enterprise, but have an opportunistic cropping operation nearby. And the Mosaic agriculture opportunities might lie in sort of different market options and diversification into crops, rather than boosting productivity of existing operations. So seeing what you might be able to do differently. And just the last point there, it requires a lot of careful planning, a fair bit of ticker, I think, because it's not for the faint-hearted. I'll leave it there, Greg.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And you're pretty much on the money. It's not for the faint-hearted at all. So just getting into a few more questions before we finish everything up for today. One of the biggest challenges that we've had is around the regulatory environment. Is there any work being undertaken to evolve the relationships between the different groups, for example, DAFWA and OEPA, so that we can get a consensus of opinions?
Yeah, I think the particular issue there is the restrictions on the forages that you can grow in WA. Yeah, and that does need to be sorted out, because particularly if you're talking about forage crops, but it's not just that. It's when you're looking at irrigated agriculture more generally, trying to overcome some of the regulatory requirements. I know someone trying to grow, someone when they grew rice there a couple of years back in the Ord, there were all sorts of issues with just getting equipment up there and crossing borders and certificates and things like that. So there does need to be some harmonisation of the regulatory area, and some of that work is going on in a number of areas. Some of it comes back to tenure as well, and that's also, I know, an issue in WA. It's becoming less of an issue in the NT, and likely to be less of an issue in Queensland as well. But some work has been done, for example, around trying to get more consistent in the tenure and diversification arrangements to allow these sorts of things to happen.
Thank you for that. Are the yields stated, for example, 40 tonne per hectare, per annum or per cut?
No, that's per annum, and it's in dry matter basis. So, but I should add a note of caution there. It's pretty difficult to achieve those sorts of yields at the moment without a lot of effort and planning. Although I said that in the system they got operating in the Hammersley Agricultural Project there at Rio Tinto, where they're using Fertigo, they're putting the nutrients in the water supply there. They are getting somewhere in that order of 40 tonnes of dry matter per year, per hectare.
Okay, thank you for that. Where's the other one that I was just looking at there? Okay, you've taken some big assumptions on the farming skills. Graziers make the worst farmers. Do you have any other further comments?
Yes, yeah, you're probably right. In generally, graziers probably don't make very, haven't got the history of being crop farmers. So, yeah, so that needs to be thought through carefully. And if you're doing it on enough scale, you can probably, need to bring in those skills, specific skills. Now, unlike the more developed areas in irrigated cropping areas and just more intensive broadacre cropping areas, even dryland ones in, say, in New South Wales, southern Queensland, where you've got a whole swathe of consultants there as well that provide input and advice to the farmers that's just absent from the north at the moment. And so a lot of thought does need to be given to that skilling up of the support workforce needed to undertake any more intensive agricultural development work. I think there are likely to be issues if people just decide they're going to go out and do a bit of irrigation without getting the right skills. So that is a major challenge, and it shouldn't be understated.
Okay. Look, we do have more questions. If it's okay, I'll get those questions to you so that you can respond to them, because I am very conscious of time, considering we are coming up to 1:30. So at this present point in time, I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for your time and your insights today, for passing on your expert knowledge into the issues and opportunities for irrigated agriculture in the northern beef industry. Obviously, it's a topic that would or could open many doors for the cattle industry. So thanks to you for helping us better understand the topic. So just in closing, ladies and gentlemen, these Beef Connect webinars are a partnership between Beef Central and Future Beef. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the great daily emails from Beef Central. And if you haven't signed up yet, please pop over to beefcentral.com and do so. Also, don't forget to visit the Future Beef website. It's your one-stop shop for beef information across Northern Australia. And in due course, you'll find the webinar recording there. We will also be looking for feedback from today's webinar. So I'll be sending out a link to a survey along with the recording in a matter of course, hopefully this afternoon. So folks, that's all for today. Again, I'd like to thank Andrew for sharing his knowledge, and a big thank you to all of you for attending and coming along and interacting with us today. It's been a pleasure having you with us. So until we connect again, it's all the best and goodbye for now.